I want you to think about Jerusalem. What comes to mind? For some of us, it might be religious sites. For others, it might be what's been on the news more recently, especially in regards to the new opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem on May 14th, the consequential protests in Bethlehem, and the simultaneous but unrelated protests that happened in Gaza. A simultaneous but unrelated protest that happened in Gaza that left more than 60 Palestinians dead and over 2,000 injured. But an easy way to think of Jerusalem is actually to think of Boston. They both have everything from history to commercial centers, and it's all interconnected. This is a map of the old city of Jerusalem. In this one section of the city, you have homes, settlements, schools, those religious sites that I mentioned earlier, hospitals, shops. Even in this one section of Jerusalem, it's incredibly easy to see how interconnected the Israeli and Palestinian conflict really is, which is exactly why it hasn't been resolved for the past 70 years. But I'm here to try and change that. Hi, my name's Janna Ramadan, and today I want to talk to you about how looking at the changing demographics, quality of education, and access to holy sites, it becomes evident that the corpus separatum plan, which essentially establishes Jerusalem as an international city, offers the best solution to the Israeli and Palestinian conflict in the city of Jerusalem. So before we move on, I just want to clarify what a corpus separatum is. It's a term that first came to fruition from United Nations Resolution 181, which is colloquially known as the Partition Plan. In it, the United Nations did two major things. The first was it took the then Mandate of Palestine, a British colony, and broke it up into two countries. 52% of the land went to Israel, while 48% of the land went to the creation of Palestine. The second thing that this partition plan did was it established Jerusalem as a corpus separatum. And the United Nations at the time thought of it as sort of like making Jerusalem like the Vatican City, right? It wouldn't be a part of any other country, but it would have its own kind of city government and run on its own. But that plan stayed largely on paper. And today I want to talk to you about how looking at the corpus separatum and bringing it back could actually resolve a lot of the conflicts and the consequences of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict in Jerusalem. So let's start with demographics. From my interviews, especially one with Nidal Al-Azra, he's an executive director for 1-for-3. It's an organization that provides healthcare aid for Palestinian refugees. He spotlighted that there are two major points in time when there have been a creation of Palestinian refugees. The first is in 1948, and that coincides with the 1948 Nakba, which is the Arabic word for exodus. So let's set the scene, right? You're a Palestinian, it's 1947, you're living in the then colony of the UK, and you see some new neighbors coming in. Those are mostly Holocaust survivors. And then all of a sudden you hear about this thing called the Partition Plan, UN Resolution 181. And like I just said, it split up the then colony of Palestine into two countries. And by coincidence, you happen to live on the part of the land that is now Israel. This is no longer your land. You cannot live on this land anymore. And so because of that, the United Nations estimates that over 700,000 Palestinians became refugees. It's been 1 to 2 generations since then, 1948 to 2018, and now UNRWA, which is a United Nations humanitarian aid group that provides aid specifically for 1948 refugees and their descendants, estimates that there are 5 million individuals who have the right to return from that conflict. And so I just mentioned the right to return, and it's actually something that's really crucial to the issue of demographics and the changing demographics within this conflict. And we actually think about it for a lot of other refugee situations, right? So in the same way we think about Syrian refugees being able to return back to Syria when the war is over, or Yemeni refugees being able to return back to Yemen after the war is over, Palestinians claim their right to return back to their homes once the war is over. And so that is why we have to look at these refugee populations and their descendants. Now the second point in time is in 1967. And I'm not kidding, this is going to sound insane, and it's almost unbelievable, because in the span of 6 days, Israel was able to defeat a surprise attack from Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Iraq. In 6 days, Israel not only defeated their armies, but they also expanded their territorial claims. They went all the way north into the Golan Heights of Syria, they went all the way south into the very tip of Egypt, and all the way east to the Dead Sea and Jordan. So remember how we said that the partition plan broke up the territory into Israel and Palestine? For Israel to reach either Egypt or Jordan, they have to go through Palestine, and they did. They went straight through, and that created over 300,000 refugees. It's been roughly 1.5, maybe 2 generations since then, 1967 to 2018. So that population now amounts to 1 million people. So we can add that up, 5 million, 1 million, that's 6 million people who can claim the right to return to their homes in Israel. The population of Israel, as reported by the World Bank in 2016, was 8 million people. We have a population 3/4 the size of Israel's population that can return. If they go back, they will change the population of Israel practically overnight, and that same result will happen in Jerusalem, where East Jerusalem is mostly Palestinian, but West Jerusalem is mostly Israelis. So the population, including my family, could return back to West Jerusalem, change the demographics of Jerusalem practically overnight, and result in a majority Palestinian population. And that leaves Israel, who due to the status quo currently runs Jerusalem, with 3 options. The first is to remain democratic, but to lose their Jewish identity. Now let's think about that for a second, right? Israel's a Jewish state. For them to lose their Jewish identity, even in one city, is like losing your mission statement. That's just not feasible, so we can cross that out as being an unreasonable situation. The second is that they lose the democratic form of their governments, but they keep the Jewish identity. And that's arguably what's happening right now, because in a study done by the Washington Post, and they reported on it, they found that most of the citizens in Jerusalem that are Palestinian that apply for Israeli citizenship don't end up getting citizenship. So when the votes come around, Palestinians don't have anyone representing them in Jerusalem because Israeli Jerusalemites have their citizenship, but Palestinians don't. So there's already that issue. That's not actually a solution. That's kind of what's happening already. The third option is the corpus separatum. And so what that would do is it would make it so that regardless of the demographic changes that we can expect, or any unexpected ones in the future, the people living in Jerusalem have a way to represent themselves. They choose their government, they can politically be empowered and vote, and regardless of whether they come from, their nationality, as long as you're a citizen of Jerusalem, you will have a government that represents you. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is education. So all the excerpts I'm about to show you come from a study done by the Council of Religious Institutions of the Holy Land. It's a group of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish leaders, and they're funded by the U.S. State Department. And in this study, they were looking for bias in the education system. So the first is an Israeli state book, or textbook. And in it, I want to highlight one thing, that it sets up Arabs waging a total war against Israel. So we know what a war is, right? You go and you defeat your enemy. But a total war takes that to another level. Instead of going and just defeating Israel, it implies that the Arabs want to go in and eradicate Israel. They want to get rid of them. So if you're an Israeli student learning from this textbook in Jerusalem, you're learning that Arabs are your enemies, right? Because they want your country, and by extension you, gone. The ultra-Orthodox Jewish book doesn't really change this, it actually amplifies it by using biblical allusions. And in this case, you have the little lamb being Israel and wolves being the Arabs. So on one end, you're setting up Israel as a vulnerable sheep, they're innocent, right? But then the Arabs are wolves, they're savages. So that creates another implication. The Palestinian textbook doesn't even do a better job at this, though, because they don't even say Israel in this excerpt. They just say the enemy. And by implications of what's going on in the rest of the excerpt, you can piece it together that the enemy is meant to be Israel. So if you're a Palestinian child learning from this textbook, you're also learning that Israelis are your enemy, that they don't want you around. So how can we reasonably expect a population to grow up learning to at least hear the other side if they're taught from a very young age that the other side wants them dead? That just doesn't make any sense, right? But if we had the corpus separatum, then we would have a more international or inclusive education system. The textbooks that students would learn from would include the good and the bad that both sides have done, because both sides have done good and bad things in this conflict. And from that, you have a generation growing up learning to at least see the other side. And in that, you set up both short and long-term benefits from a corpus separatum. Because short-term, you have kids growing up learning to see the other person. It creates a less tense environment in Jerusalem. But in the long term, this population could actually grow up to communicate and create a compromise in the future that could potentially resolve the entire Israeli and Palestinian conflict. Now, the next thing I want to focus on are holy sites. This is the Holy Church of Sepulchre. It's important to Christians because it's believed that Jesus was crucified at this site. This is Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's important to Muslims. It's the third most important mosque in all of Islam, and it's also one of two contested sites where it's believed that Prophet Muhammad ascended to the heaven. This is the Western/Wailing Wall. It's the last standing wall of King Solomon's kingdom, and it's important to Jews. This is the Dome of the Rock, or Qubbat al-Sakhra. It's important to Muslims for both its Islamic architectural reasons, but it's also the second contested site where they believe Prophet Muhammad may have ascended to the heavens. And this is the Mount of Olives. It's important to Jews because it's believed that several of their prophets are buried at these sites. Now, when you learn about Jerusalem, or this area in general in history, you really learn about like the Crusades, the Roman Empire is just coming in and completely destroying the city of Jerusalem as a whole. But we're better than that now, right? It's 2018, we have morals, we know what it means to respect another person's religion. We've moved on from that, right? Apparently not, because we still have issues in access to holy sites. And it just happened, the most recent occurrence was in July of 2017. So in this day, it was in early July, you have two Palestinians had an altercation with 3 Israeli soldiers, and it happened on the site that's near Al-Aqsa Mosque. So if we set up the stage, I'm standing like right between, you have Al-Aqsa Mosque here, Dome of the Rock, and then the altercation happened like somewhere down there, right? And in the situation, you had the 2 Palestinians, they ended up killing the soldiers, but then you had Israeli citizens coming in and also killing the Palestinians. So all 5 parties of that altercation ended up dead. But Israel, as a result, they went and they closed Al-Aqsa Mosque for the Friday prayer. So for those of you who don't know, a Friday prayer for Muslims is like Sunday church for Christians. It's the holy day. And Henry Fakat of Al Jazeera estimates that over 10,000 people attend the Friday prayer at Masjid Al-Aqsa, every single week. Just this past weekend, or this past Friday, on the first Friday of Ramadan, over 100,000 people attended Al-Aqsa Mosque Friday prayer, as estimated by the Institute for Middle Eastern Understanding. So to close this mosque is huge. And the fact that a government did it, not the religious institution that's supposed to be in charge of it, the Islamic Waqf, is a breach of both international law, Israel's own Holy Land law, and a breach of the status quo. And it took over a month for Palestinian protesters and protesters around the world to force Israel to get rid of the metal detectors that they put on Masjid al-Aqsa when they reopened it 2 days later, and to get rid of the limits they put on who could enter. Because 2 days after they closed it for that Friday prayer, Israel reopened the mosque, but this time, if you were a male under the age of 50, you weren't allowed inside. It took a month to resolve this conflict. A month of protesters, a viral video of someone praying in the street getting kicked by a soldier. If Jerusalem was a corpus separatum, this would have never even occurred. Because not only would the government that Jerusalem would be ruled by not have the power to close a religious institution, they wouldn't even have the military power to enact that decision. So in this way, the corpus separatum would protect all of our accesses to holy sites, regardless of the religion you practice or the nationality or whatever situations occur around the holy sites. So I've now talked to you a little bit about why the corpus separatum presents the best solution to Jerusalem, and I'd open the floor for questions.
amazing presentation.
Thanks.
So I was just wondering how the current events of the United States moving their embassy to Jerusalem has affected the trajectory, of your project, and how you think that will complicate the possibility of making Jerusalem a corpus separatum in the future.
Yeah, great question actually, because I've been trying to deal with that throughout my project. So I started off the year looking at Jerusalem before the decision to move the U.S. Embassy even occurred, and at that point it had been a pretty peaceful time for some time, but then once they moved the embassy, you had protests occurring all around the world, and since moving the embassy and officially opening it on May 14th, the violence has only escalated, where there are now political prisoners in Israel, and it's getting really intense. But in all honesty, when I started the project, this sounded relatively feasible, but now looking at it, and especially in the way the United States provides such a power role in this conflict and has played such a mediator, but it's not a mediator anymore, role for the past 70 years, the actions that the U.S. is doing in promoting the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel are actually going further away from establishing Jerusalem as a corpus separatum, but the benefits that the city would reap from having a corpus separatum remain there. So it's kind of difficult right now to see what will happen, just because the U.S. holds such power and the UN hasn't really done anything to counter the events. Just saying that we don't agree with your statement isn't really causing any change on the ground level. But that's a really good question, and honestly, it's something that I can't really anticipate, but my best guess with what's happening is that Jerusalem, there either might be a war coming up, or there could be just the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, but that's going to lead to a whole nother set of repercussions that, we could spend all day talking about that. But yeah, great question.
Hi, Janna.
Hi, Leah.
I really liked your presentation, and I just wanted to ask how likely you think it is that a corpus separatum would be established, and what the UN would have to do for that?
Yeah, so it's sort of similar to the last question that I answered, but when I started the project, it seemed feasible. Right now, not really, to be honest. It doesn't sound as feasible just because the international community isn't really pushing in a corpus separatum anymore. It's more pushing towards the reestablishment of the status quo, where it's supposed to be a neutral city, but really Israel's running it, just because it takes it away from who the ownership claims. So as it stands right now, I don't know how feasible it is. We'd have to wait and see what happens as a result of the opening of the U.S. Embassy, not just a week later, but a few months in the future.
Thanks.
Hi, Janna. I really like that presentation.
Thanks.
And my question was, how would you enforce the security of a city? Well, my main question is, right now, Israel's the one policing the streets and having the dominant authority. So how would you guarantee the security of a city with an ethnicity breakdown of 60% Jewish and 40% Muslim? Because if it was a democracy, I feel they would just vote along ethnic lines, and then that would just increase the violence. And with no authority to stop that violence, wouldn't that just give Israel another excuse to push back into the city? My question is, how would you guarantee the security and stability of such a problematic area?
So I don't have the numbers exactly, but there was one study that I looked at where it surveyed the Jerusalemites' perspectives of a two-state solution, or what kind of solution they'd want to see in the future. And unlike the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the Jerusalemites, people who live in Jerusalem, actually have a pretty peaceful mentality on it, in the sense that they'd rather see a two-state solution, and they believe at a higher percentage that both Palestinians and Israelis do lay claim to the territory, and they could live together. So in the sense that socially there wouldn't be as much tension, because you would have the current situation, but instead of repressing the East Jerusalem or going into it with settlements, you would have just an open city, in the sense that the people would be able to actually communicate with one another without having political tensions forcing certain dialogue or certain conversations among them. In regards to creating or establishing the security of the city, that's something that the individuals would have to take, and I focus mostly on the benefits in my project, because I didn't decide what kind of government or politics that the people living in Jerusalem would choose to have represent them, because that's something that they have to choose. And when it comes to policing, then you'd have to have something along the lines of, like, not peacekeepers, but similar to it in that respect, because Jerusalem, like the Vatican City, wouldn't be able to go and, like, wage war on another country. But if you, like, the situations that we've seen where there's been violence occurring, it's mostly been, like, politically affiliated. But if you have a corpus separatum, it would run like the Vatican City, where it's protected, you have peacekeeper-esque security measures, but it's unlikely that you're going to be seeing political divides coming out in violent manners. And if you do, then you would take care of it the same way they do in the Vatican City, right? You'd, like, arrest people, but it wouldn't be arrests depending on nationality or decisions being made depending on, like, ethnic origins. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. So if you have any more questions, feel free to write them on a note card. And if you want, you can go to my website. It's called sharingolives.weebly.com. And it describes the project that I've already presented to you, more information on it, why I chose Jerusalem in the first place, and a timeline of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict as a whole. So you can see really how far back this entire conflict extends past 1948. So now, the reality of the situation, though, is that Israel is more powerful than Palestine in regards to economics, militarily, and even in regards to international support. These power dynamics play directly into Jerusalem. They dictate what water sources you get to drink from, where you get to live, and even what charges you can die guilty of. But living a life of human dignity should not be dependent on nationality. Living a life of human dignity should not be a privilege. These are the faces of Israelis and Palestinians. Some of them are victim to the humanitarian crisis that's come out of this conflict. Some of them have been victim to the world's longest siege that's come out of this conflict. But none of them, not a single person here, has seen peace in their homes for more than 70 years. I'm here today talking to you on the 10-year anniversary of the Gaza War, the 51st year anniversary of the 1967 Six-Day War, and the 70th anniversary of the 1948 Nakba and formal beginning of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. It's our job to ensure that 70 never becomes 100. We know what these people deserve. They know what they deserve. It's just our job at this point to make sure that their governments both see that and enact that too. Thank you.